She was just a black high school student sitting quietly in her first-class seat with a completely valid ticket in hand. But the flight attendant didn't even ask. She raised her voice, questioning her, and forcefully moved her to the back, into the economy class, while dozens of silent passengers looked on. No one stood up in her defense. No one said a word. But when the girl picked up her phone and sent one short message, everything changed. Within minutes, the engines were shut off, the captain halted the flight, and federal agents were on their way. What the airline didn't know was that she wasn't just any passenger. She was the reason the entire flight would be grounded. The 3B first-class seat embraced the small frame of Amaya Carter, a 16-year-old black girl with a pensive gaze, clutching her faded green backpack tightly to her chest. This backpack, which had accompanied her through many hot summers and cold winters, had now become her silent companion on the most important journey of her life. Outside the window, the early morning sun lit up the endless runway. Amaya gently placed her hand on her knee, softly brushing the strap of her backpack as if to calm herself. This wasn't just any flight. It was a milestone marking her maturity, her first solo flight. No parents, no relatives by her side, just her facing the vast world out there. The first-class ticket she held was purchased with immense pride by Dr. Naomi Brooks, her godmother, the woman who had always believed in her and supported her. That ticket was not just a reward for her excellence in the summer science program, where Amaya had outperformed hundreds of students from across the state. It was a symbol of the trust that she belonged in any space she longed for, even this luxurious first-class cabin. Amaya sat up straight, her headphones resting lightly on her ears, but music still off, her favorite science book still open on her lap. Though her heart fluttered with excitement, it was filled with pride. Quiet pride, the kind of pride that came from knowing she had earned this place through her intellect, her effort, and her undeniable abilities. One by one, the other passengers boarded, and the first-class cabin filled with tailored suits and expensive colognes. But Amaya didn't mind. She gazed out into the vast blue sky, letting the light wash over her brown cheeks, reflecting a youthful maturity glowing in the silence. In that moment, she had no idea that within minutes that silence would be shattered, and the quiet pride she carried with her would soon face a challenge far more ruthless than she could have imagined. But for now, Amaya Carter sat there, alone, but not lonely, calm as a flower before the storm that had yet to arrive. As Amaya let herself bask in the warm rays of sunlight coming through the window, the sound of high heels clicking steadily on the carpeted aisle drew her attention, and the attention of everyone in first class, to one direction. Sandra Whitmore, the head flight attendant, walked forward with the confident stride honed over years of service. Her neatly pressed uniform and the gleaming name tag on her chest were symbols of authority. Her expertly applied makeup carried a faint, rehearsed smile, the kind she had perfected through hundreds of flights, often reserved for passengers deemed worthy. However, when Sandra's eyes swept over Amaya, the simple black schoolgirl in a faded gray hoodie, well-worn sneakers, and an old backpack resting at her feet, the smile faltered for just a moment, almost imperceptible to anyone but Amaya. In that fleeting moment, but one that was crystal clear, Sandra's eyes flashed with doubt, as if Amaya's presence in first class was somehow wrong, a stain that needed to be erased. Without attempting to hide her suspicion, Sandra strode directly to seat 3B, standing above Amaya with an air of arrogance. With a voice louder than necessary, enough for the passengers around to turn their heads, she spoke. "You're in the wrong seat." Not a question, not a polite reminder. It was a decree, cold, firm, as if Amaya's presence here was a mistake that needed to be corrected immediately. Amaya flinched, looking up. Her eyes, still warm from the sunlight, now met Sandra's cold, piercing gaze. In a reflexive effort to be polite, Amaya softly replied, her voice small but clear, "I think this is my seat, 3B. Sandra tilted her body, arms crossed, her gaze scrutinizing Amaya as if she had just said something offensive. She glanced briefly at the ticket peeking out from Amaya's hoodie pocket. A quick, indifferent glance without any real intention of verifying it, before she coldly snapped, "This is first class, young lady." The last two words fell from Sandra's lips with a deliberate emphasis, as if the very fact of Amaya being a young lady was reason enough for her not to be allowed in this space. Around them, a few passengers, men in tailored suits, women wearing pearls, began to glance over at Amaya, some with curious looks, others with subtle disapproval, but not a single word of defense was uttered. Sandra stood straight, her gaze looking down on Amaya, as though she were a baggage inspector inspecting an undeclared item. In that moment, she was no longer a flight attendant. She was a gatekeeper, someone who had taken it upon herself to decide who belonged and who didn't in this space. And with all her biases hidden beneath a professional facade, Sandra Whitmore came to her conclusion the moment she saw Amaya Carter. No questions asked, no need for verification. You don't belong here. Amaya bit her lip, trying to stay calm as a slow burn of anger rose in her chest. She gripped the strap of her backpack tightly with her small hand. In her mind, one question rose, short, sharp, and aching. Is it just because of my skin color? But Amaya didn't argue, not because she believed Sandra was right, but because she understood. In places like this, any defense would easily be twisted into causing a disturbance. What Amaya didn't know was that this quiet, steadfast silence, her refusal to react the way Sandra expected, would soon spark an earthquake that Sandra could never have imagined. Amaya tightened her grip on the strap of her backpack, her head lifting with a patience far beyond her 16 years. Under Sandra Whitmore's harsh gaze, she slowly reached into her hoodie pocket, pulling out her boarding pass, still intact in its glossy plastic sleeve. With all the politeness she had been taught from a young age, she presented it before Sandra. There was no hesitation or fear in her movement, just a simple gesture, much like the many times she had shown her pass on buses or during scholarship exams, where everything needed to be transparent and fair. The small card clearly printed, Seat 3B, First Class. An undeniable proof. However, instead of taking the pass as any professional flight attendant would to confirm it, Sandra merely glanced at it in a fleeting second. A quick, dismissive look, and then immediately stepped back half a step, narrowing her eyes, her lips pressed thin in a cold, cruel line. Then, in front of the entire first-class cabin, with a shrill, high-pitched voice sharp as a knife, she declared, "No way! You need to move to the back to economy class." Not a polite suggestion, not a request for further verification, but a sentence passed without trial. In that moment, the air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Whispers stopped. The sound of keyboards ceased. The unconscious motions of buckling seatbelts and flipping through magazines halted mid-air. All eyes turned to Amaya, eyes filled with various emotions: curiosity, discomfort, mild shock, and worst of all, indifference. Amaya felt each of those gazes pierce her like cold needles. Stares from adults in well-tailored clothes, those who allowed themselves to stand on the sidelines of an injustice unfolding right before their eyes. Not a single person spoke up. Not a single person stood to ask, "What's going on?" or simply suggested a more thorough check. That silence, heavier than any accusation. Amaya took a deep breath, her small hands gripping the strap of her backpack, but she didn't cry. No pleading, no panic. Inside, she was left with nothing but a bitter ache, Once again, her efforts were not enough to erase the prejudice imposed by others. Before her, Sandra Whitmore held her head high, her eyes glinting with petty triumph. She didn't bother to ask a colleague to verify the pass, didn't check the passenger list, nor did she call for the head of the crew for assistance. Sandra only needed a glance and blind belief that Amaya Carter, a black girl wearing a hoodie and old sneakers, could not possibly be a legitimate first-class passenger. And with that misguided belief, she coldly gestured, "Take her luggage. Hurry up. You're delaying our boarding process." The tone of her voice, refined over years of serving first-class passengers, now pierced through Amaya like a knife, not with blood, but with a sharp sting to the very core. Amaya stood up, her hands still gripping the backpack strap, trembling, but no words of protest escaped her lips. Not because Amaya believed Sandra was right, not because she was afraid, but because she understood. If she argued back, she would immediately be framed as causing trouble, dragged away under the silent complicity of the crowd, transformed into the problem rather than the victim. The shame didn't only come from Sandra Whitmore's actions. It came from the invisible but painful complicity of everyone around her, those who saw but chose to silently turn away. Amaya lowered her head and stepped out of her seat. The sound of the backpack strap scraping against the floor echoed alone in the silent, first-class cabin. She walked slowly past rows of shiny seats, past expensive suits and trendy leather handbags, faces lifted, then quickly dropped, as if simply avoiding the sight could wipe their responsibility clean. A few other gazes, colder, struck her like silent lashes. "Serves you right. Go to your place. This isn't where you belong." Amaya bit her lip, feeling every step weigh heavily, as if she carried the burden of a long history of prejudice, rejection, and invisible denials that she and others like her had suffered for generations. When she reached economy class, Amaya found an empty seat by the window. She slumped down, her backpack placed neatly under her feet, her hands tightly clasped together as if holding herself. Her gaze was directed out the window, but what Amaya saw wasn't the vast sky beyond. It was her own reflection in the glass. Small, silent, and once again pushed into the shadows because of a shallow prejudice. No one in economy class asked if she needed help. No one asked why the young girl sat there, her eyes still carrying the deep hurt. She sat quietly, amidst murmurs, stolen glances, and hurried side-eyes like a lost shadow among strangers. In the palm of her hand, Amaya gripped her phone tightly. Not crying, not angry, only a quiet resolve swelling within her. She unlocked her phone with a trembling finger, opening the messages. Her fingers typed slowly but decisively. "She made me leave my seat, told me I don't belong there. I'm in economy class now." The message was sent in a few short seconds, and in that heavy moment of silence, Amaya Carter didn't know. With that single tap, she had triggered an underground earthquake that no one on this flight, not even Sandra Whitmore, could stop. As Amaya's small hand pressed the send button, those few short words in the message suddenly felt heavy, like a sigh that had been held in for a lifetime. "They made me leave my seat. They don't believe I have a ticket." No anger, no complaints, just a raw, quiet truth wrapped in a few lines, much like the way she chose to face the world. The phone lay silently in her palm, its screen black, reflecting the tense face of the young girl, lips pressed tightly, eyes distant, but her shoulders carrying an unusual strength for a 16-year-old who had just been treated as an intruder in an entire airplane cabin. No one looked at Amaya as she quietly walked past the aisle between first class and economy. No one turned to ask what had happened, or at least to ask if she was okay. The invisible door between the two cabins, once defined by the numbers on the boarding pass, now seemed like a stark boundary, a place where a mistake in the eyes of someone with power could forever negate the rightful existence of a black high school girl. Sandra Whitmore didn't look back. After handling the issue, as she confidently described after each disruption, Sandra straightened up, adjusted the red scarf draped over her neck, and turned on her heel, walking toward the forward galley, where flight attendants typically gather before takeoff. Her face remained indifferent, as if she had just completed an ordinary task, like removing an oversized piece of luggage or asking a passenger not to put their feet on the partition. In her eyes, Amaya wasn't a person with the right to be present. She was simply an anomaly to be adjusted. In the galley, Sandra took a glass of water, sipped it, and leaned against the wall as if nothing had just happened. Outside, the cabin began to fill. The sound of passengers stowing luggage, adjusting seats, and exchanging hushed conversations gradually increasing, filling the void left by the incident. Meanwhile, Amaya withdrew into a seat near the back of economy, where the dim light from the ceiling created a soft, hazy glow. She chose the window seat, as she always did when feeling out of place among a crowd. At least outside the window, the sky was something no one could take from her. Her faded green backpack, the item as familiar to her as her own body, was neatly placed under her feet. There was no room left for anger or resentment in her heart. Instead, there was an empty silence, a cold ache spreading from within her chest, where her belief in justice had just been pushed off the runway, just like she had been pushed off her seat. She lowered her head slightly, as if searching for any warmth left in her trembling palm. In her mind, Sandra's voice still echoed like metal striking stone. "No way, you have to move." That voice didn't just ring in Amaya's ears. It reverberated in her heart, like a warning bell about a world that wasn't ready to accept her, no matter how many achievements, how much effort, how many reasons she had to be proud. But then, when her phone screen lit up, a small light, like a candle flickering in the wind, Amaya saw a reply from Naomi. The two words appeared neatly, simple. What happened? Though brief, those words weighed heavier than any science book she had ever loved. It wasn't just a question, it was an affirmation. That somewhere, someone was listening to her, believing in her, and ready to act for her. Amaya stared at the message for a long time before slowly replying. Her fingers gently typed, no longer trembling but full of determination. "The head flight attendant doesn't believe my ticket is mine. She made me leave my seat, said I couldn't sit in first class. I showed my ticket, she didn't even look at it properly. I stayed silent, but they didn't stay silent with me." For the first time throughout the short journey from the front of the plane to the back, Amaya felt she was no longer alone. She knew Naomi Brooks, her godmother, wasn't an ordinary person. She wasn't someone who would sit quietly while justice was distorted. And she wasn't the type of person to let a black schoolgirl endure this kind of humiliation in silence. Outside the plane, the sun had climbed higher above the horizon, its light spilling through the windows, casting a bright but indifferent streak across Amaya's face. She blinked, turned, and looked straight at the glass as if she could see through it to the horizon of justice that was slowly beginning to reveal itself. Beyond the cockpit door, the communication system blinked on, and an urgent voice began to speak through the command center on the ground. From that moment on, Flight 263 would no longer be just an ordinary flight. It would become a fateful flight, where the silence of a young girl would force the entire system of power in the sky to stop, to listen, and to take responsibility. Amaya didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. From the moment Naomi read the message, she was no longer alone on this journey. The moment Amaya's phone screen lit up, She saw Naomi's reply almost instantly. No emojis, no empty words of comfort. Just 2 words, cold yet firm. What happened? Amaya stared at those 2 words, her heart pounding in her chest as if, in that very moment, hope was rushing into her. A hope not because of what Naomi might do, but simply because on the other side of this silence there was someone who was truly listening, someone who believed in her without asking any further questions about the context. Her hand trembled slightly as she typed back, but this time it wasn't out of fear or shame like a few minutes ago. It was because something inside her was beginning to shift. Something akin to strength. The head flight attendant doesn't believe I have a first-class ticket. She made me leave my seat. I showed her my pass, but she didn't check it. Now I'm sitting in the back. Flight 263, seat 3B. Amaya hit send, as if she were sending all the pain she had just endured through an invisible transmission, and when the screen confirmed it had been sent, she waited in silence. Outside the window, the sun had risen higher, casting a golden glow on the runway as if nothing had happened, as if the world was still calmly passing by, indifferent to the invisible wounds of a 16-year-old girl who had just been erased from a space she should have belonged to. Just seconds later, a new message appeared on the screen. Stay where you are. Don't say anything else. Let me handle it. No additional exclamation points. No empty promises like, everything will be okay, or I'll talk to the airline, which adults often say when they don't intend to take action. Just a short sentence, but it felt like electricity coursing through Amaya's trembling courage, making her lift her head, sit up a little straighter, and gently release her grip on the backpack strap. She knew Naomi Brooks was not like other people. Not only was she a loving godmother, Naomi was one of the most powerful and principled women in the aviation industry, the Director of Aviation Safety at the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, who had coordinated emergency internal audits and forced the nation's largest airlines to admit their faults with a single phone call. And now, that woman was beginning to act. On the 48th floor of a glass building in the heart of Washington, D.C., Naomi Brooks was in the middle of an online meeting with the FAA Safety Advisory Board when the message arrived. She silently excused herself from the camera for a few minutes, stood up, and walked to the large window, looking down at the street below. Her gaze sharp, her lips pressed into a straight line. After reading Amaya's last message, Naomi didn't need any further verification. She didn't request a second opinion. She didn't need to know what pressure the flight attendant had been under. She knew exactly what had happened. She had seen it too many times, and this time, it had happened to the one person she loved the most. Naomi returned to her desk, dialed the emergency contact line with the flight operations team. Her voice was low, slow, but firm, like a bell tolling against steel. This is Director Naomi Brooks. I need you to hold Flight 263 from Atlantic Blue, which is preparing to take off from Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Immediately contact the flight crew. Reason? The voice on the other end asked, sounding anxious. Priority federal complaint about discriminatory behavior and violation of ticket verification procedures regarding a minor passenger in first class. I will send the full documentation later. For now, order the aircraft to remain at the gate until verification and independent inspection are coordinated. The voice from the operations department hesitated for a few seconds, then replied, Understood. We'll do it right away. Naomi didn't say another word. She hung up the phone, sent a priority alert to the FAA communication system with the note. Priority hold. FAA oversight requested. Passenger A, Carter, age 16, improper removal from assigned seat, immediate compliance review initiated. In the cockpit of Flight 263, Captain Robert Hayes had just received a standard inspection signal from the coordination station when the internal communication system beeped with a flashing red message. Urgent, FAA flag, hold position. He frowned, took off his headset, and turned to the first officer. We've got an unclear situation. Hold position, don't move to the runway. The first officer raised an eyebrow. Technical malfunction? Robert Hayes shook his head. No, this is coming from above, very high. In over 20 years of flying, he had dealt with engine fires, unruly passengers, and electrical system failures, but he had never received a request to stop a takeoff because a passenger had been removed from their seat. He knew that could only come from the FAA. And only one person in the FAA had the authority to act this quickly, Naomi Brooks. He glanced at the passenger's name now listed for review, Amaya Carter, Seat 3B minor, verified ticket. A note appeared below. Removed without verification. FAA investigation active. In the front galley, Sandra Whitmore had just taken a sip from her plastic cup when a flight attendant rushed toward her, whispering, "The captain just ordered to hold the plane. No takeoff." Sandra raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What's going on? A technical issue?" "Not that." "There's an order from above. FAA is intervening." The cup in Sandra's hand shook slightly, and condensation on the rim of the cup suddenly felt cold. She didn't say anything else, but a flicker of unease passed through her eyes. She didn't know that. A woman standing on the other side of the country had just taken action with a single command, and that wave was about to crash down on her like a storm on a clear day. The FAA's announcement had just come through less than a minute ago, and Captain Robert Hayes was still holding on to the controls when the red light on the dashboard flashed, followed by a firm voice from the priority communication system. "Flight 263, hold at the gate. Do not taxi to the runway. A serious incident is under investigation." The voice left no room for doubt. It didn't carry the tone of a suggestion or hint, as it would for delays caused by luggage issues or late passengers. This was a direct command, and the communication frequency made it clear that it came from no one other than the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the only agency with the authority to issue emergency directives, even when the plane was ready for takeoff. Captain Hayes placed his headset on the control panel, his brow furrowing instinctively. He had dealt with complex situations, false engine warnings, unruly passengers, even an emergency when a radar system failed while flying over Canadian airspace. But never in over 20 years of flying had he been ordered to halt an entire flight due to a complaint from a passenger, before the plane had even taken off. He turned to the first officer, his gaze sharp and quick. "FAA directive. Hold at the gate. No taxiing." The first officer paused for a moment, then nodded quickly. No further explanation was needed. With the level of urgency from the FAA, all operations had to stop immediately. No arguments, no delays. Robert pressed the intercom system, his voice echoing through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received a request to hold the flight at the gate for a short time to complete some technical procedures. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated. We'll provide an update as soon as we have more information." In the economy cabin, Amaya heard the announcement. She didn't turn her head, nor did she look up at anyone. But deep inside, a slight tremor touched her chest, like an electric current, a mix of uncertainty and something else, perhaps hope, or maybe the impending storm. No one, not even Sandra Whitmore, could have known that a simple message of a few words would bring the entire plane to a halt. In the galley at the front of the first class, Sandra still stood poised and professional, but her eyes began to waver. If the hold was due to a mechanical malfunction, the crew would have been notified in advance, and technicians would already be on the way. But this time, no one came to check the technical systems. There were no sounds of disassembly, no chatter from the maintenance crew, only an eerie silence, a very dangerous silence. Sandra set her cup down, adjusted her belt, and walked out of the galley with her usual confident stride. But behind the uniform her lips felt dry, and in her chest a sharp nagging discomfort reminded her of her recent actions she had always believed were by the book, but now, perhaps they were no longer by the book. At Atlantic Blue's Operations Center, the FAA priority alert blinked on the screen. The message that appeared was a cold, jarring slap to the face. FAA priority alert. In-flight compliance violation. Flight 263. Passenger removal incident. The Operations Center immediately relayed the information to the Director of Flight Operations. Every link in the chain began to activate. The legal department was flagged for immediate involvement. There was an unwritten rule that every airline knew well. If the FAA intervenes from the ground, this was no longer just a customer complaint. It was an investigation, and everything had to be prepared as if facing a political storm. In the passenger cabin, the silence after the announcement was gradually replaced by subtle exchanges of glances, quiet whispers like threads weaving through the air. A man sitting in seat 2, salt and pepper hair, gray suit, gold watch, turned to the woman beside him and whispered, "Seems like the plane's having trouble, huh?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her voice small but sharp. "Not technical. It's a passenger." She then glanced toward the economy cabin where Amaya sat quietly by the window. "It's that girl." The man furrowed his brow. "The black girl? Why dash?" The woman didn't finish her sentence, but her gaze carried a weight of implication, as if she had just realized she had witnessed something that shouldn't have been ignored from the start. At the back of the plane, Amaya remained seated, her hands gently resting on her lap, her phone lying on the folding tray in front of her. The screen was off, but the light outside reflected her face. No longer the naive expression of a 16-year-old on her first solo flight, but the gaze of someone watching for something larger than herself. In her heart, there was no fear left. Instead, there was a strange feeling, like standing in the middle of a storm, but knowing that this time she wasn't alone. In the galley, Sandra Whitmore walked down the aisles, checking seatbelts, but the polite smile that was usually present on her face had completely disappeared. The nods, the polite gestures, now carried an evident awkwardness, as if she were trying to piece together a mask that had cracked. When she passed seat 3B, the seat she had just forcibly taken from a girl a few minutes ago, believing a girl like her couldn't sit here, Sandra paused. The seat was neatly vacant, no one had replaced it, and the headrest was still carefully folded back as it had been. A voice echoed in her mind. "She showed the ticket, I didn't check it." Behind Sandra's seemingly unshakable arrogance, a flicker of doubt was slowly eating away at her belief in what she had just done. In the FAA Operations Center, Naomi Brooks had just received confirmation. The plane has been held at the gate. The oversight team is connecting with the flight crew. The situation has been flagged as Priority Level 1. Naomi didn't speak. She nodded slightly, then opened the flight tracking screen, her eyes scanning the icon for Flight 263. A bright dot, stationary amidst a network of hundreds of flights moving like streaks of lightning. A stationary dot, for a girl who had been pushed out of her seat, and for a woman who did not remain silent. The storm hadn't arrived yet. But everyone on Flight 263, even those who caused it, and those who remained silent, began to feel. The sky was about to shake. The first-class cabin was still bathed in soft golden light, the hum of the air conditioning steady, accompanied by the gentle clink of cups and plates on the service trays. The elegant passengers, after the initial hesitation, had begun to return to their phones and magazines as if the flight was simply delayed due to some minor technical glitch. Meanwhile, Sandra Whitmore, while the atmosphere was beginning to crack beneath the surface, allowed herself to lean back against the galley wall, a glass of water in hand and an expression of calm indifference. She stood there, one hand holding the cup, the other smoothing her uniform skirt, her gaze flicking over the first-class cabin with her usual watchful eye. Her demeanor was no different from that of thousands of flights before. Still the sharp, polished Sandra, always knowing how to maintain control over everything in the cabin as if it were her own private world, where she had the right to judge and make final decisions. She still believed everything had been handled properly. That the girl, the student in the hoodie who didn't belong in first class, had been placed back in her rightful place without any major consequence. For Sandra, it was a professional win, a necessary action to uphold the unspoken standards she had maintained for the last 15 years in the sky. But not everyone in the crew shared her perspective. Eric Dawson, the young flight attendant who had been in the job for just 3 years, entered the galley from the left aisle, still holding the cloth he used to wipe down trays. He hesitated, stopping for a moment before speaking. Though he didn't want to disrupt the atmosphere, his hesitation inadvertently created a noticeable pause in the already taut space. "About the girl earlier," Eric spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "I saw her ticket. It was for seat 3B. Sandra turned her head toward him, tilting it slightly as if analyzing whether she should respond or simply ignore him. Then she chuckled softly, a laugh devoid of humor, filled instead with the arrogance masked by years of experience. "Eric, you're still too green. In this profession, looking at a ticket isn't everything." He froze, his eyebrows furrowed for a brief moment. Sandra continued, raising her glass of water, as though teaching a stubborn student. "You'll learn, over time, that not everyone who presents a first-class ticket really belongs here. Some people, just by looking at them, you know something's off." The statement didn't require further elaboration. It was enough to reveal the true nature of the distorted belief system Sandra held to run her cabin, that the standard wasn't just on the boarding pass, but in how passengers looked, what they wore, what color their skin was, how they spoke, and most importantly, whether they made her feel like they belonged. Eric didn't speak for a few seconds. He wasn't someone who easily confronted others. But his gaze on Sandra was different now. Not just the confusion of a young employee, but the look of someone who had witnessed a line being crossed, one for which there was no justification. He nodded slowly, then quietly responded, almost just for the two of them to hear. "I think that girl didn't do anything wrong." Sandra placed her glass down on the tray, sighing tiredly, as if the girl, and now Eric, were forcing her to explain the obvious. "You don't understand, Eric. On a plane, we have to maintain order. There's so much to control. If we let people sit in the wrong places, don't control things from the start, what will happen? A girl like that, who is she? Whose child is she? What if it's a mistake? Are you going to take responsibility when someone complains?" But the moment that question was asked, Sandra herself felt a hollow silence open up within her, a void she had never noticed before, or had intentionally ignored. Because she hadn't asked anyone. She hadn't verified with any passengers. She hadn't checked the passenger list. She hadn't called the head of the crew. She hadn't followed any standard procedure to handle the situation. She had simply given an order, just because it felt wrong. And now the plane was being held at the gate. No technical issue, no engine failure, no bad weather. But because of a decision made from prejudice, based on a superficial glance, but one full of authority. Eric still didn't say anything. He simply took a step back, nodded slightly, and turned away, leaving Sandra alone in the galley, where the sound of the engines outside was drowned out by a far more suffocating silence. She placed her hand on the cold metal edge of the galley counter, staring into the empty space as if hoping to find a loophole to justify what she had just done. But for the first time in 15 years in the sky, Sandra Whitmore was no longer certain that experience was enough to protect her from the storm approaching from the horizon, one she hadn't seen on the radar. Because this time, she wasn't just facing a girl. She was facing a system that was waking up. Sandra Whitmore was still standing in the front galley, her palm lightly resting on the cold metal edge, her gaze distant, as if searching for some vague reassurance among the scattered sounds in the first-class cabin. But that moment didn't last long. The cockpit door opened from the front. The dim light from the control panel illuminated a straight line across the carpet, and Captain Robert Hayes, the calm man, who rarely stepped out of the cockpit unless absolutely necessary, tilted his head out, his voice low, not angry, but with no room for compromise. "Miss Whitmore, come in here for a moment." No further explanation, no usual collaborative tone between crew members. Just a short order, enough to make every alarm in Sandra's body go off like a siren. She swallowed hard, straightened up, adjusted her skirt, and walked toward the cockpit with the demeanor she had carefully honed in front of the mirror. Always the picture of someone in control. But with each step closer to the cockpit, Sandra's heartbeat shifted, and a quiet, unfamiliar feeling began to creep in, one she hadn't felt in a long time. Anxiety. The door closed behind her. The air in the cockpit was cooler but also heavier. Captain Hayes wasn't sitting down. He stood next to the first officer's seat, his hand resting on the armrest, his cold eyes not looking directly at Sandra, but toward the hanging headset. Without saying anything further, he slightly tilted his head to the right, signaling for her to put on the headset. Sandra looked at him briefly, as if waiting for some kind of introduction, a "what's this about?" But when she received nothing more than a stiff nod, she slowly put on the headset, still maintaining a slight smile on her lips, as if this were just another routine technical exchange. But as soon as the headset settled against her ear, the voice on the other end froze that smile like wax meeting ice. "This is James Sandler, Senior Manager at the FAA, speaking on behalf of Director Naomi Brooks." Just hearing that name, Sandra felt her chest tighten. Naomi Brooks. A name anyone who had worked in aviation for any length of time knew. Not for shocking statements or power displays, but for something much stronger: reputation and unwavering principles. If her name came up in an investigation, that case would never be closed with a simple apology. It would leave real consequences. Consequences that ran deep into the roots of the system. The voice continued without giving Sandra a moment to collect her thoughts. "We've just received an urgent complaint from Director Brooks regarding a minor passenger being forcibly removed from a first-class seat, despite having a valid boarding pass with no violation of any kind." His voice wasn't loud or harsh, but every word rang in Sandra's ear like a hammer on a glass table, sharp and cold enough to make her palms sweat. "The passenger's name is Amaya Carter, 16 years old with a ticket for seat 3B in first class. She was asked to move without any verification of her ticket or coordination with the flight crew." Sandra opened her mouth, ready to respond. a familiar reflex, as she had done many times before when passengers complained, "I just thought that." But James Sandler interrupted before she could finish. "I'm not asking what you thought. I'm asking if you verified the ticket with the passenger list or ground staff before forcing the passenger to leave their seat." There was no room for escape in her words. Sandra fell silent for a heartbeat, then quietly replied, her voice cracking, "No, I just glanced at the ticket. I thought." "So, you didn't verify. You just relied on your intuition to decide whether a passenger was valid or not?" Silence. A silence that lasted like the stillness of a clock second-hand stopped. Then James Sandler continued, this time with a voice slower and heavier. "Do you know that passenger is the goddaughter of the FAA director? And even if she wasn't, removing a valid passenger just because you felt they didn't belong in that seat already violates at least 3 FAA safety principles and internal procedures, doesn't it?" Sandra could hardly hear the details anymore. Words like violation of principles, no verification, urgent complaint swirled in her head like a chaotic storm. The 15 years of experience she had once prided herself on, now it couldn't protect her from the undeniable truth. She had made a decision not based on procedure, but on bias. "Now, listen carefully." James's voice dropped like the wind before a storm. "You will return to economy class, invite passenger Amaya Carter to return to her assigned first-class seat, and you will do this politely, publicly, and with a clear apology." Sandra opened her mouth, ready to ask, "Could I just speak to the girl privately?" But the answer was already waiting for her. "No. Your actions took place in front of the passengers. Your apology must be the same." "And then?" Sandra asked softly, her voice thick with emotion, as if sensing the inevitable storm that awaited her behind the door of the airplane. "Then?" James paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "Then, a federal inspector will be waiting for you on the ground to begin the official investigation, and we expect your full cooperation." The headset went silent. The static disappeared, but the emptiness left behind felt like an invisible roar. Sandra slowly removed the headset with trembling hands. She had never felt the cockpit, where she had entered hundreds of times, feel so small and suffocating. With each step as she opened the door and walked back into the cabin, she no longer walked as someone controlling the space. She walked as someone passing through a silent court of public opinion, each gaze a judge waiting for her answer. The cockpit door closed behind Sandra Whitmore as she stepped out, the heels of her shoes gently sinking into the thick carpet of the first-class cabin. But with each step toward the economy cabin, the confidence she had always carried seemed to slide off her spine, leaving behind a cold emptiness she had never known before. The red silk scarf around her neck was still tied in the airline's standard style. Her uniform dress still crisp, her hair not out of place from the combing, but all the external perfection now couldn't shield the growing unease that was starting to show in the corners of her eyes, in the way her hands unconsciously clenched together. The looks began to follow her, no longer those of admiration for a seasoned flight attendant, but of scrutiny, confusion, and quiet realization. Some passengers looked up from their seats, others lowered their heads and whispered, but not a single greeting, not a familiar nod. The atmosphere had changed so drastically it felt unsettling, a silence that even she could not deny had a reason. As she reached the economy cabin, Sandra saw the girl sitting by the window in the last row of the front section, her back straight, her hand still resting on her faded green backpack, her eyes fixed outside as though nothing could disturb the stillness she was holding on to. Sandra slowed down. With each step toward the girl, she felt herself sinking deeper into a pool of awareness, a place where the usual justifications no longer surfaced to save her from drowning. And when she stood before the girl for the first time in her career as a head flight attendant, Sandra wasn't sure where to begin. A few seconds of silence passed. Then, with everything she had left in her professional reserve, Sandra forced a smile. A thin, crooked smile like a crack in glass when the light shines too close, and spoke. "There's been a misunderstanding. You, Carter, please return to seat 3. Her voice was no longer high and firm. Instead, it was strained, as though each word was being pulled out of her throat by an unavoidable force. Amaya didn't turn to face her immediately. She tilted her head slowly, meeting Sandra's gaze, but her eyes were no longer surprised, no longer angry. Instead, they held a quiet, sharp light, one that spoke of a person who understood the situation too well, and now only wanted to hear the truth. She tilted her head slightly and asked, in a voice so calm it was like a silent cut, "Why was I the only one asked for a ticket? Why didn't you ask the white man sitting next to me? Why?" That question wasn't an accusation. It was a head-on strike, carrying the weight of the entire truth. Sandra froze. Her tongue felt dry. Her throat was tight, caught between an empty excuse and an undeniable truth. A few nearby passengers began to subtly turn their heads. Their gazes were full of suspicion. The people who had been silent moments ago were now as if called upon by that very question. No one spoke, but the entire cabin was holding its breath. Sandra licked her lips, glancing around instinctively, looking for an escape, an ally, a supportive glance like she had always received before. But there was nothing. Only a dense silence, swirling around her like a wall slowly closing in. I didn't mean to. At the time, it was just a reflex. You know, sometimes people make mistakes. Her voice grew weaker as she spoke the last word, as if she herself realized how meaningless that sentence was. Because Sandra knew full well that wasn't a mistake, it was prejudice, a deliberate selection, masked under the name of professional intuition. Amaya nodded lightly, without saying a word. Then she turned her gaze back to the empty space above. The first class section that had been taken away from her less than an hour ago. The atmosphere had changed. People were watching. People were witnessing. She stood up, picked up her backpack, and said nothing. As she passed Sandra, she paused for a moment. Without turning around, without looking at her, her voice came out soft yet chilling. If I hadn't sent that message, this would never have happened. I would have just been a kid sitting in the wrong seat. No one would have known. No one would have cared. Sandra felt as if her last protective layer had been stripped away. The words weren't bitter, they weren't hostile, but they were a sentence. An absolute exposure of what she had just done, and of herself. Amaya moved forward, walking steadily, though her shoulders still seemed small beneath the worn hoodie. Her steps were no longer heavy as they had been when she was forced out of her seat. Now, each step was a powerful knock on the invisible door of the system. A door that had been closed to her an hour ago but was now forced to open. Amaya took each step back to the first-class cabin, the path she had been forced to leave less than an hour ago in silence and humiliation, under dozens of indifferent or skeptical gazes. But this time, everything was different. Not because she walked with pride, or because someone had rolled out a carpet to welcome her. There were no applause, no greetings, no words of encouragement. But the silence was no longer the same as before. It was thicker, more uncomfortable, heavier. Amaya could feel every pair of eyes following her every move, eyes that had turned away, avoided her, or thought, This has nothing to do with me. When they saw a girl being dragged from her seat simply because she didn't look like she belonged there. Now, those very eyes could not look her in the face. As Amaya passed the first row of seats in the first-class cabin, a woman wearing pearl earrings quickly lowered her head, as if remembering something important to check in her handbag. A gray-haired man, sitting near her former seat, glanced over and then looked out the window, his brow furrowed as if something crucial had come up. No one greeted her, no one asked, but everyone knew. That girl was returning to her rightful place. Amaya stopped at seat 3B, the seat she had been forcibly removed from as if she were an intruder. The seat was still intact, reclining at the angle she had adjusted it to. The headrest was clean, and no one had taken her seat in the time that had passed. It was as if everything had been waiting for her, not because they respected her, but because they didn't know what else to do. She placed her backpack at her feet and sat down quietly. She straightened her back, her hands gently resting on her thighs. No one told her to be strong, but no one could make her shrink back anymore. A few whispers started to ripple through the rows behind her. Someone cleared their throat, another adjusted their glasses, a young woman leaned toward her husband and whispered something. Then, a middle-aged man from the opposite row spoke very softly, but enough for those around him to hear, "We've been silent in the wrong way." That sentence wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It wasn't aimed at any specific person. But every person in the cabin felt as if it was directed right at them. All those who had witnessed the girl being humiliated, being ordered to leave her seat, heard the head flight attendant's loud commands, but no one stood up to ask, why? Those who had the opportunity to stop it from happening and did nothing. Amaya didn't turn her head, she didn't react, but those words still echoed in the air, no need for anyone to repeat them. In the galley at the front, Sandra Whitmore stood alone, her back against the cold stainless steel cabinet, her lifeless eyes staring at the beam of light filtering through the frosted door. She heard the whisper. Though no one spoke directly to her, she knew that the man wasn't talking about them. He was talking about her, about the actions she had taken and the silence she had received as a brutal reflection from the collective. Never before in her life as a flight attendant had Sandra felt the cabin become so foreign and oppressive. Everything was still the same. The narrow aisles, the luxurious leather seats, the spotless glasses and cups. But now, it no longer felt like her space. It felt like a silent courtroom where every detail was evidence against her. Sandra's gaze fell on seat 3B. The girl hadn't glanced at her once since she had returned. No anger, no resentment. That was what Sandra couldn't bear. If Amaya had been angry, if she had yelled, blamed, or cried, Sandra might have found a reason to justify it. The girl overreacted. But no, the girl didn't need to do anything. She just needed to exist, to sit in her seat and remain silent. And still, she made everyone look at themselves. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere continued to shift. A few passengers began pulling out their phones, not for entertainment but to check the news. An internal memo had begun to leak. Flight delayed due to violation of protocol involving a minor passenger. One person whispered, "Isn't that girl the daughter of an FAA official?" Someone else responded quietly, "I heard it's the director of aviation safety." Though no one had confirmed anything, the wave was spreading, from the whispers in the cabin to the ground surveillance offices, to the press, social media, and even the halls of power. As for Amaya, she sat still, not moving, not smiling, not shedding tears. Her phone screen still dark, but in her heart, she knew Naomi was following every movement. And she also knew something very big was happening, not just for her, but for people like her, the ones who had been pushed aside simply for not looking like they should be there. For the first time during this journey, Amaya gently rested her head against the seat, not to rest, but to allow herself to feel the space that had been taken from her. This time, as someone who truly deserved to be there. The silent wave within the cabin was quickly turning into a widespread tremor, not only among the passenger seats but also within the crew itself. The exchanged glances down the narrow aisle between the cabins were no longer just filled with curiosity, but now carried a very real sense of hesitation, as if everyone understood what awaited them when the plane touched down. The news that the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, had officially launched an investigation was no longer just a whispered rumor behind closed doors. In the hands of the head flight attendant coordinating the flight, an internal pager flickered continuously, an unmistakable message from the operations center, clear and undeniable. Flight 263. FAA will board to investigate violation of procedures. Prepare to cooperate. All crew members must report. As soon as the message appeared, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin seemed to fall into a silent, heavy fog, and no one felt it more clearly than Sandra Whitmore. Still leaning lightly against the galley counter, Sandra's eyes tried to maintain composure, but everything inside her was beginning to fracture from within. The words she had just read echoed in her mind like a bell ringing in an empty house. Investigate violation of procedures, directly, report all crew members. Just a few words, but enough to undo the 15 years she had spent building her reputation. Eric Dawson entered from behind, his tall, slender frame quietly navigating through the pressure, trying to maintain professionalism, but clearly unable to hide the tension in his eyes. He stood next to Sandra for a long moment, saying nothing. All that could be heard was the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of passengers, and a silence that seemed to force someone to speak first. Finally, Eric leaned in, his voice low and soft, just enough to reach her ears. They'll ask why you only checked one person's ticket. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't harsh. But that sentence was like a knife quietly laid on the table, forcing the other person to face it, even if they couldn't make excuses. Sandra didn't turn her head. Her shoulders remained straight, but her chest rose and fell with each breath, and when she finally opened her mouth, her voice, this was the first time in the entire flight, no longer held certainty. I don't know, I just thought... But even she didn't believe the words she was about to say. Eric didn't respond, but in his gaze, sympathy had vanished. Only disappointment remained, the disappointment of someone who had witnessed a wrong and realized they had been silent. Sandra subtly turned her face, meeting the younger eyes of her colleague, which had turned much colder. She saw clearly, not only was her career unraveling, but so was the image of herself she had always trusted. She had never imagined that a normal decision, like hundreds of others she had made on flights before, could become the end of her career. But this time she knew. It wasn't the decision that was at fault. It was in the way she had viewed others and accepted it as the norm. Just then, the plane gave a slight tremor. It wasn't from the engine starting, but from the cabin door being reopened, something that never happened on a flight after the boarding process was completed. From the front of the cabin, two figures appeared. A woman in the dark FAA uniform with the nameplate Officer Rhodes pinned to her chest, walking beside a man in a gray suit, a federal badge gleaming on his jacket pocket. Neither of them spoke. They simply walked straight in, their presence commanding, as if silence itself were the strongest declaration of power. The entire first-class cabin fell silent. A passenger dropped a magazine. A woman quickly switched her phone to silent mode. No one asked who they were. Everyone already knew. This was no longer an internal airline matter. An event had been officially recorded. An action had been elevated to a formal file. And someone would have to answer. The cabin door clicked open with a sharp, cold sound, echoing through the airplane like a wordless command that made all movements come to an abrupt halt. 2 Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, officers appeared at the entrance. One woman in a dark uniform with silver-embroidered shoulder patches, the nameplate, Officer Rhodes, pinned to her left chest, walking with a steady stride. Alongside her was a tall man in a gray suit, his face expressionless, a gleaming federal badge on his jacket pocket under the cabin lights. They didn't speak. They didn't smile. They didn't greet anyone. Their mere presence was enough to make the entire first-class cabin feel suffocating, like the air had been sucked out with just 2 steps. Amaya Carter lifted her head from seat 3B, her eyes quietly following the 2 figures. She didn't say anything. She didn't react. But in those deep brown eyes there was a new light, one of confirmation, as if what all the adults around her had been doubting for the past several minutes was now sealed by the undeniable reality. She wasn't wrong, and what had happened could not be wiped away with a wave of the hand. The 2 officers walked straight to the cockpit. Captain Robert Hayes greeted them with a solemn nod and stepped back, as if handing over the control of the plane to a higher authority. After a few brief exchanges in low voices, Officer Rhodes turned back, scanning the cabin as though searching for a reaction. Then, with a clear but not loud voice, she spoke. "We need to speak with Head Flight Attendant Sandra Whitmore." No one moved. No one needed to ask anything further. All eyes immediately shifted toward the front of the first-class cabin, where Sandra was still standing, her back stiff, her hands lightly gripping the metal counter behind the galley. Her face was pale, her chin trembling, her eyes staring blankly into the distance as though by not looking back, everything might disappear. But reality had entered the cabin, and it didn't need her to look to exist. Eric Dawson subtly moved aside, as though instinctively clearing a path. Sandra left her spot with legs that felt heavy as if weighed down by stone. No one forced her. But each step she took toward the front of the plane felt like an invisible escort, where the sentence had already been passed, just waiting to be read aloud in the merciless silence of the dozens of witnesses. When Sandra reached the front, the man in the gray suit extended his hand, not to shake, but to guide her out of the cabin. There were no handcuffs. No one was pulling her along. But no one could mistake this for a voluntary action. This was an escort. Not criminal, but strictly according to FAA procedure for individuals under investigation for serious passenger rule violations. And what made it suffocating was that it all unfolded in complete silence. No one spoke, no one shouted, no one applauded. Only the eyes, only the suffocating silence. And only one person, Sandra, couldn't escape. As she walked past seat 3B, where Amaya was sitting, their eyes met for a fleeting moment. Amaya didn't show any emotion. She didn't bow her head. She didn't look away. She just looked. A calm gaze, but as deep as the ocean. One that didn't need words, but still made Sandra feel as if she had stepped out of the world she had once controlled. Sandra turned her face away. She couldn't bear that gaze. The airplane door opened completely. Outside, a black SUV with specialized tinted windows was parked beside the stairway. The emergency lights were flashing silently with no siren, but its presence was enough to tell anyone within 100 meters. This was not a small matter. Sandra's heavy steps descended the stairs. From the first-class cabin, the passengers could see an FAA representative waiting at the bottom of the stairs with a thick file and a face devoid of expression. Though there were no handcuffs or arrest warrants, everyone in the cabin understood. This was the moment she would have to answer with her entire career. Inside the airplane, the silence lingered a few more heartbeats after Sandra disappeared from sight. Then, a young man in seat 2C, the one who had said, "We've been silent in the wrong way," turned to the woman next to him and whispered, "I think, for the first time, I understand what civic responsibility means." The woman didn't reply, but she gently squeezed her husband's finger, as if holding on to something fragile but real. At seat 3B, Amaya closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, not because she wanted to escape, but because she knew one door had closed for someone, and another door, wider, fairer, had just opened for all the people like her. Sandra Whitmore descended the airplane stairs, disappearing into the black SUV accompanied by 2 FAA officers, leaving behind a first-class cabin filled with a silence so profound it felt as though her very presence had been the unnoticed noise that everyone failed to recognize, until it was gone. The cabin door closed, and the faint whine of the locking mechanism echoed, like a soft period marking the end of an event no one had expected to witness when they boarded the flight. But no one rushed to grab their luggage. No one tried to push their way out like during typical delays. They remained seated, as though the cabin had transformed into an unwitting theater, and they were the audience, forced to open their eyes and see what they had so often turned away from. In seat 3B, Amaya Carter remained still. She didn't cheer. She didn't shed tears. She didn't pull out her phone to take photos or record the moment. There were no victory gestures, no nod of satisfaction. Just a 16-year-old girl wearing a simple hoodie, her hair neatly tied up, sitting up straight in the middle of first class with such composure that the entire cabin seemed to adjust its breath to match hers. Outside the window, the black SUV had driven away, leaving only a faint red glow on the runway under the hazy sunlight. Amaya continued to watch, not with a look of revenge, but with a long, deep gaze, as though she knew. Justice doesn't come with blood and fire, but through the perseverance of those who refuse to run away. An older man sitting in seat 1C turned to his wife, whispering so softly, as if afraid to lose something sacred that they had just witnessed. That girl made an entire flight stop, just by her patience. The woman nodded, then, almost instinctively, looked toward Amaya, as though she wanted to say something, but instead just placed her hand on her chest, where, for the first time throughout the flight, she felt something like respect stirring. The cabin announcement came on gently. "We kindly ask passengers to prepare to disembark. Disembarkation will be conducted by Grou. Please remain seated until you are called." The wave of movement was slow. Passengers began to stand, each looking at one another as if asking with their eyes rather than words. Should we say something to the girl? But then everyone stopped. No one dared to speak, because Amaya's quiet presence now was greater than any words of consolation or praise. They silently walked past her. A few glanced over, giving a small nod, not as an apology but as an acknowledgement. We saw, and this time we won't forget. Amaya remained seated until the plane was nearly empty. Only a few flight attendants remained, and one FAA officer stood at the front of the cabin with a thick file and a gaze of anticipation, along with one person watching her with a quiet, unwavering presence, Eric Dawson. He didn't need to say anything, but in his eyes Amaya saw it clearly. He understood, and from now on he would never stay silent again. The final announcement came, this time just for her. Last passenger Amaya Carter, please disembark. FAA staff will escort. She stood up. Her movements were neither hurried nor slow. Her backpack lifted calmly, the strap resting over her shoulder like it had at the start. But this time, her small shoulders didn't hunch in shame. They stood straight, as if they were carrying a truth that had been proven. Amaya walked toward the front of the plane, each step firm, like placing her feet back on solid ground after a storm. She didn't raise her head like a victor, but she didn't bow her head like someone defeated either. She simply walked, like someone who knew, by walking straight ahead, everything after this would have to change. When she stepped out of the cabin door, the sunlight hit her eyes. Not blinding, but strangely warm. At the end of the jet bridge, waiting for her was not a camera, not a crowd of reporters, but a single person. One woman in a navy blue coat, her hair neatly pinned up, standing silently with her hand over her heart. Naomi Brooks. Amaya walked toward her, not in a hurry, and when she stopped in front of Naomi there was no need to ask, no need for a greeting. Naomi looked at her, her eyes steady and warm, then spoke. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Amaya nodded, her voice calm. "I don't need them to shout that I was right. I just need them to stop and think." Naomi smiled faintly, saying nothing more. She placed her hand on Amaya's shoulder, and together they turned and walked into the airport hallway. No medals, no speeches, just quiet footsteps. And the truth. As soon as Amaya and Naomi disappeared down the airport hallway, the brilliant sunlight from outside couldn't chase away the shockwave that was deepening within the heart of the United States aviation industry. At the headquarters of Atlantic Blue Airlines, in a large glass meeting room overlooking the runway, an emergency meeting was convened less than 3 hours after Flight 263 had been grounded. No longer were there whispers. No longer were there email responses or Zoom meetings behind closed doors. This time, the entire senior executive team, from the CEO, legal director, HR, to the head of flight safety, had to face what they had avoided for years: systemic responsibility. The short memo from the FAA arrived first, neatly tucked into a cold white file. On the title, in bold red letters, were the words, "Passenger Service Violation Report, Severity Level High." Beneath it was the brief but shocking preliminary conclusion. Passenger was discriminated against based on appearance. No ticket verification from the system or coordination with flight crew. The head flight attendant made a personal decision beyond professional authority. And the final line, underlined, immediate action required across the system. CEO Martin Raines, a man known for his toughness and reluctance to admit mistakes, sat upright, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the event summary projected onto the LCD screen in the middle of the table. Under the harsh white light from the ceiling, the wrinkles on his forehead were evident. Not from age, but because for the first time in his career he realized this incident couldn't be controlled with a press release. "How much time do we have?" he asked, his voice rough from being on the phone all morning. The legal director quickly replied, "None left. The press is already spreading the news. The FAA is requesting updates every 48 hours. If we don't act now, we won't just lose public trust, we'll lose our operating license." A heavy silence fell over the room, thick enough that you could hear the soft click of a pen shaking in someone's hand. The head of HR, a sharp woman with a commanding voice, spoke more slowly this time. "The FAA has requested 3 mandatory actions starting next week. 1. All flight crew, regardless of rank, must undergo monthly bias training rather than yearly as before. 2. The check-in system and flight attendants must implement a 2-step seat verification process. Boarding passes must be scanned through the system and verified manually with the ground crew before passengers are asked to move. 3. We must establish a policy to protect whistleblowers from discrimination, whether they are passengers or internal staff. She paused for a moment, then added in a deeper voice, "And finally, the FAA has officially confirmed Head Flight Attendant Sandra Whitmore will be terminated immediately. No reconsideration." A few heads lowered. One person quietly tore off a note, crumpled it in their hand. Sandra, once considered the discipline core of the senior flight attendants, praised for her exceptional in-flight crisis management skills, was now a living example of what happens when confidence surpasses humanity. A media advisor in the room, his voice urgent, spoke up. "What are we going to do about public opinion? There's a video circulating online of passengers filming when the FAA boarded the plane. There's footage of the girl's face. The online community is calling her the girl who grounded the flight." Martin Raines sat motionless for a few seconds, then nodded slowly. "We can't fight this wave, then we'll have to go with it." Just a few hours later, a series of official statements were issued, not just with the cold, detached language they usually used, but with a purposefully changed tone. "We acknowledge that Flight 263 reflected a significant flaw in our procedures and human awareness. Passenger Amaya Carter was treated unfairly, and this will never happen again." Across all branches of the airline, the internal messaging system sent out 3 new directives. Anti-bias training will be held monthly, with checks in place. No absences allowed. All flight attendants must follow the 2-step seat verification process, both electronically and manually with ground staff. Any employee found discriminating or ignoring discrimination by others will face immediate disciplinary action with no exceptions. In a smaller meeting room at the FAA, Naomi Brooks, not in her authoritative jacket, but quietly sitting with a laptop in front of her, looked at the draft of the new policy, an amendment titled Regulation Protecting Minor Passengers from Discrimination, the Amaya Carter Clause. A small note at the bottom of the page read, "We are not rewriting procedures just to polish our records. We are rewriting them so that no 16-year-old girl will ever again have to cry in silence." When the memo titled the Amaya Carter Clause was approved and sent to all airlines across the United States, the name of that 16-year-old girl officially entered the system, not as an internet phenomenon, but as a part of the legal, cultural, and human structure of the aviation industry. Amaya knew this, but she didn't smile. She didn't see herself as a trailblazer. She simply wanted to return to being a normal student, one who shouldn't have to prove she deserves respect. As major news outlets tried to contact Naomi for interviews, and renowned magazines invited Amaya for cover photos and to tell her story with headlines like "The Girl Who Changed the Sky," she quietly declined them all. Not out of fear, not out of a desire to run away, but because what she did was never meant to be seen. She just wanted to be seen as visible. Yet, despite her silence, the story of Flight 263 continued to be told everywhere, and in a way that no one could ignore. At flight attendant training centers across the U.S., a video clip from the internal cabin cameras of Flight 263 was added to mandatory training programs. It wasn't just a lesson in how to handle a passenger issue. It was a vivid reminder of the damage caused by unconscious bias, something that could start with an innocent question but bury the dignity of a person. At high schools, particularly in citizenship and sociology classes, teachers printed out summaries of the incident, along with discussion questions. What would you have done if you were the person sitting next to Amaya that day? The story was no longer just an event. It had become a lesson, not in textbooks, but one that left a deeper mark than any chapter. One day, at a small meeting of a student advisory group at a high school in Seattle, a black freshman with curly hair stood up after watching the video reenacting the flight. That girl didn't need to scream. She just needed to hold on to her belief. And that's why the adults had to listen. The supervising teacher didn't say anything, but that very day, the school added a new unit on professional bias to the orientation program for office staff and security. At an aviation industry symposium in Atlanta, Naomi Brooks, this time not as a director buried in reports but as the keynote speaker, stepped onto the stage in a simple dark blue suit without any flashy slides, holding just a printed photo on faded paper. Amaya, sitting in seat 3B, quietly, sitting straight, her hands resting on her backpack. She said, "This is how a revolution begins. Not with a bang, not with violence, but with a girl who refuses to leave the seat she deserves." The entire hall stood still, and for the first time in many years, no one laughed, no one clapped in the usual social way. Everyone sat quietly to hear that silence resonate in their hearts. At a university seminar, when Amaya finally agreed to appear, not on television but in a private class for students studying passenger management, she was asked, "How did you remain calm when everyone turned away from you?" The girl paused for a few seconds, then answered slowly, "Because I knew I didn't do anything wrong, and I knew someone would stand by me." The answer didn't stir intense emotions. It didn't make anyone cry or cheer, but it made every gaze drop, because everyone was asking themselves, would I be the one to stand up or stay silent again? What about Sandra Whitmore? She disappeared from the professional radar, her industry record marked with a red flag, no airline daring to sign a new contract with her. She wasn't arrested, she wasn't paraded as a villain in the media. But in the flight attendant community, her name became a warning bell. Every new training lesson now begins with one line: "Don't become another Sandra Whitmore." Not because she was cruel, but because she believed that prejudice was experience. And that made a girl have to leave the seat she had rightfully earned. On a quiet evening, Amaya sat by the window, holding a hot mug of cocoa, her eyes looking at the sparkling stars outside. Naomi was typing on her laptop at a nearby table, the light from the screen casting on her calm cheek. They didn't speak, only listening to the soft wind passing through the glass window and the steady tapping of keys. After a while, Naomi looked up and softly asked, "If you could do it again, would you do it differently?" Amaya smiled, turned her head, and replied with a voice as light as a breath but as solid as stone, "I would still sit in seat 3B, and this time no one would be able to make her stand up." Amaya Carter's story didn't need anger or noise. Just through silence, through an unwavering belief in justice and human dignity, she made the entire aviation industry look at itself. Not everyone can stop a flight, but would you dare speak up if you saw injustice right before your eyes? If this story touched your heart, please hit like, share with those you care about, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next inspiring journeys. Let's spread values that make the world a better place.